Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce Andrew Blum, who is joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Andrew's here today to discuss his book, Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet. What is the Internet? Where is it? The nuts and bolts of the Internet is an unexplored territory until now. Andrew Blum is a correspondent for Wired and a contributing editor to Metropolis. He writes about architecture, infrastructure, and technology for many publications, including The New York Times, The New Yorker, and Slate. Please join me in giving him a really warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Amy. It's really fun to be here. It's a place I've thought about a lot for a long time. Normally the kind of starting point for the talks I've been giving at bookstores and other places is I will come and explain how the internet works. And that obviously seems like a preposterous proposition for all of you. So I was actually just curious how many of you work on the sort of internetworking side of things, the places where Microsoft either at a sort of global transmission level, at the networking level, or the places where Microsoft then touches other networks. Yeah, just a couple. Okay, that's good. Good, excellent. That makes me feel much better. So what I started with is I was writing mostly about architecture, about buildings, about actual buildings, and what sort of the wonderful thing about that is that you can study the history of a place, or talk to the architect, or the economics behind the building, or its function, or all these things. But at the end of the day, you can get up and go see the building and smell it and feel what it sounds like and what it looks like and experience it with your sort of embodied presence. And what I found, or even on the grander scale, if many buildings create cities, and you can walk through a city. So as complicated as cities are, you can still get there. You can still kind of experience them away from your screen. But I found that several years ago that the opposite was more true, that I was doing all of my work in front of my laptop screen. And then since about 2007, when I got a smartphone, I was then getting up at the end of the day and looking at the phone that I carried in my pocket. And that seemed like a really strange way of being an architecture writer, of trying to write about the physical world when everything was interpreted through my screen. And not only that, but the world behind my screen seemed to have no shape whatsoever. There was sort of no sense of what it was. Any time you looked for images of the internet, this was the only thing that came up. This kind of amorphous blob that was meant to be infinite, that was meant, you couldn't really figure out where you were on it. That always reminds me of the blue marble picture of the Earth, the sort of Earth, the Apollo picture. The Earth is a spaceship, in that it seems completely uncontainable and this absolute expanse. And I was so struck by the idea that there was no physical reality back there. There was no way to sort of get at what the nuts and bolts of this place, this ostensible place, was behind my screen. When I was living entirely behind that screen. And this amounted to something of a kind of low-grade existential crisis, because how could I know who I was if I didn't know, what this place was, and if the only image of this place was something that was meant to be so magical that you couldn't possibly understand it. Oh, and then one day this happened, a familiar thing. My internet broke, and the cable guy came to fix it. And he followed the wire from the router behind my couch, back underneath the basement of my building in Brooklyn, out back into the backyard. And there was a big tangle of cables up against the wall. And then he saw a squirrel running along the cable. And he said, "I think that's your problem. I think a squirrel is chewing on your internet." And this seemed sort of preposterous, because the internet was a transcendent set of protocols. It was the thing that caused revolutions and changed online dating and absolutely everything. It wasn't something a squirrel could chew on. But if it was, if in fact a squirrel had chewed on my internet, then there had to be other pieces that squirrels could chew on as well. And I got this image of what would happen if I started to yank the cable from the wall and see where it would lead. Here, maybe, I suppose, in some form. that was the starting point. But the problem was that if I then sort of went to look for images of the actual physical infrastructure of the internet, there weren't any. Only fools looked for the actual internet. So this is, many of you probably know this, but this is the episode of South Park when the internet breaks, but there's no internet to know that the internet's broken. And they become internet refugees in California because that's where there's internet. And they try to fix it. They finally find this place, the internet, and they try to fix it by playing the Close Encounters of the Third Kind song at it. But that doesn't work. And then they eventually kind of, climbs up the ramp, unplugs it, and plugs it back in. And salvation, the flashing yellow light is steady green. Every peace prevails. And I felt a little bit silly if this was what I was trying to do. Or this was the internet. From the IT Crowd, the British sitcom, where they convince their colleague that they have borrowed the internet from the elders of the internet so she can use it in an office presentation. And normally it lives at the top of Big Ben because that's where you get the best reception. But they've procured it just for the afternoon. And she says, "This is the internet? The whole internet? Is it heavy?" And they say, "Of course not. The internet doesn't weigh anything." And I felt silly again that I was actually trying to find out where the box was that was the internet. Or there's the poets who have tried to figure out sort of what this might be. And my favorite is a writer named Christine Smallwood who says that the history of the internet is a history of metaphors about the internet, all stumbling around this dilemma. How do we talk to each other about an invisible God? That's probably something you guys think about a lot. And then she tries to figure out which is the best way of describing the internet, either a Tootsie Roll, a hot tub, a highway, or a plane, before finally she decides that the internet must be a very ugly thing. And she wishes instead, she says, that the internet looked like Matt Damon, or like lines of light written by an invisible hand in the night sky. So immediately we're back again to that amorphous blob. We're sort of always left with some sort of electrical thing, that's out there in the ether that you can't access at all. But there was sort of one person who seemed to know where the internet was, which was Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, who I appear to have become the champion of. But he was the one who said in 2006, when he was chair of the Senate Technology, Commerce, and Transportation Committee, that the internet is not a big truck, it's a series of tubes. And all of us thought this was completely hilarious. I'm sure you all laughed at him, as did I. But of course, it was this transcendent set of protocols. It was the thing that has changed the world. It wasn't a series of tubes that seemed to somehow entirely belittle it. But it seemed like it might be a little bit true. It seemed like, obviously, if there was that piece that a squirrel could chew on, there had to be other pieces that a squirrel could chew on. And there might be other names for them, like conduits or pipes or whatever it was. But at some point, he was right. There had to be a physical path between point A and point B. Even if we say, normally, it's broken up, it travels in so many different directions. We say that as if that doesn't mean each of those directions is still real. We say that as if you can't, then I'd find at least for an instant, some distinct physical path and some distinct place that this information is passing through. So for me, the first step was really acknowledging that they're sort of decreasing the scale and time, not saying, okay, how is this working all at once? What are the 1,000 processes going on behind the loading of a single web page? But to be a bit more reductive about it and to say, what at a single instant? Where might this be? Where is it? And it turned out, to my surprise, that there were surprisingly few places where the internet predominantly was. And so what it became, normally I sort of offer a caveat, which is to say that I'm I'm going to ignore the logical. And that seems a particularly important point to make with all of you. And to be a little bit technical, but for the moment, if in terms of the OSI stack, which I assume is a very mostly familiar thing for a lot of people, yeah, I'm operating from the dirt up to about layer 2.5, never getting above that. So sort of ignoring a huge amount of all the things that we see on our screen, and instead focusing on the physical path, focusing on where the internet is. This is, on the left, is a fiber regeneration hut in the middle of Kansas. And this came about, I started working on this as a photo essay for Wired, and was asked to find pieces of the internet that we could photograph. And I was on the phone with a PR person at one of the big global backbones, and said, so is there like a place in the middle of the country where the fiber is regenerated? And she said, let me find out. And got on the telephone a guy in Kansas City with a pickup truck who was responsible for maintaining all of the regeneration huts in a 500-mile radius. And then had this somewhat surreal conversation with him about which was the most beautiful. And it turned out to be this one. And then for me, it came down again to this being the sort of basic physical unit, a yellow fiber optic jumper cable. This was the sort of fundamental medium of the physical infrastructure of the internet. And when you bend it, you see light. It's sort of that literal. And and again, the basic unit today is a 10 gigabit per second wave of light. And that's changing, as I'm sure many of you know, up to 40 gigabits per second or 100 gigabits per second. But to begin to recognize that that was the sort of basic physical medium, these 10 gig waves of light passing through yellow fiber optic cables. And then combining in buildings where the networks of the internet connect to each other. And that, again, was striking to me to try to understand as an absolutely unequivocally physical process. The router of one network connecting to the router of another network. Someone last night asked me what a network was. Is everyone clear on that? Yeah, okay, good. But that is amazing to me, that it's so physical, that it's all about, if a Comcast to a Microsoft, a Time Warner to a Google, with a global network, with global footprints, but then touching these very particular buildings, and with an edge router on one, and an edge router on another, and a yellow fiber optic cable connected between them, strung up into the ceiling, down from one cage into the other. And this is one of my favorite buildings of that. This is 60 Hudson Street in New York. Once the Western Union headquarters, and so filled with pneumatic tubes, actually, that were carrying messages, and then repurposed starting in the 80s and more directly at the end of the 90s, as the neutral place where the networks of the internet could meet. And the scale of it, of course, is amazing. What makes 60 Hudson particularly special is I think it's 6 of the transatlantic undersea cables, all home run directly to 60 Hudson. So this is the place where, yes, there are 300 or 400 networks, depending on who you ask and who's counting, but 6 of those networks are particularly important because they are the networks of the undersea cables, with, of course, many other networks running on top of them. And the specificity of that was incredibly striking to me. And the place of this building, among a very short list of places around the world, really, as I see it, about a dozen buildings around the world that are vastly, that are absolutely the most important sort of monuments of the internet, by virtue of the fact that they are where the most networks of the internet connect to each other. In things that look like this, and again, the yellow fiber optic jumper cable being the absolute basic physical unit. But the crucial piece for me is again to try to sort of get down to the dirt, to connect it to the geography. This is the fiber vault, as it's called, the place where the fiber comes into a building, a very important building, one of these 12 buildings in Ashburn, Virginia, a building run by a company called Equinix. And when you walk into these data centers, and I use data center as a kind of generic term to describe a place of equipment, although I prefer to call these internet exchange points, the places where networks meet. When you walk into the building, and it feels like walking into a machine, and it's cold and incredibly loud, and filled with cables, and the floors are hard, and there are unhappy people on the floor trying to fix the routers, or the servers, or whatever the whole range of equipment is in there. When you walk into this building, into this room, it's hot, and it's still, and it's quiet, and it smells like dirt, because those tubes come out of the ground, and that's where the fiber comes out of the ground. And this is where, for me, this is the kind of point where this sort of vast, uncontainable thing, this whole agglomeration, is attached to the earth. This is the part where it hits the dirt. And then it's just so striking to me how few places that connects. This is in Ashburn in Virginia. This Equinix building is one of my favorite. You see Dulles Airport there. And then because of that, this is the place where bandwidth is most abundant and cheapest, and where there's the most networks, you end up with this parasitic activity where you have these large data centers as containers of data, if the Equinix is the sort of complex in the center, the data centers are then the sort of aircraft carrier things around it, sort of latching on to this major node. And a piece of the book of tubes was excerpted a couple weeks ago with the headline, "The Bullseye of America's Internet," with a satellite image and red concentric circles around that building. And if that makes you nervous at all, Equinix, the company that owns this, all for the last 2 weeks has been tweeting, "We are the bullseye of America's Internet. We are the bullseye of America's Internet." Because this is what they do. They provide the space for networks to connect to each other. And for me, the crucial social environment was NANOG, the North American Network Operators Group. Has anyone here been to NANOG? No? Yeah, okay. 2 weeks ago, great, yeah. So NANOG is the group of 200 or 300 engineers who are the inter-networkers, who are the ones who are negotiating the connections between networks. And most particularly, a subset of them known sort of loosely as the peering community. The peer people who negotiate the peer connections, the essential peer as if equal terms between one internetwork and another internetwork. And what's so striking to me is if we think about all of this happening automatically, or if those of us who aren't in the thick of it every day at least think of it all happening automatically, each of these connections is essentially made by hand. If the nanoggers, you talk about going to conferences to network, the nanoggers literally go to conferences to network. To drink a lot of beer. Yes? Is that true? Yes, that is true. To drink a lot of beer and to develop relationships and figure out who is clueful, meaning the opposite of clueless, and to then, based on that trust, acknowledge that it is worthwhile for me to connect my network to yours. And then to consummate that decision, and perhaps that decision is sweetened by someone paying the other, by becoming a customer, or not always, but then to consummate that decision by stringing a yellow fiber optic cable from my router to yours, most often in one of these very particular list of buildings. And then there's the global piece, which is by far the kind of the most poetic and in some ways the most unfamiliar and fascinating. So if satellites for international data traffic are essentially a rounding error, all of it is undersea cables, and there are fewer of them than you might expect, around 10 or 12 across the Atlantic, and fewer than that across the Pacific, and this again came out of that Wired photo essay with this sort of question: is there like a manhole near the beach where the cable lands? And they said, let me check, and it turns out yes, there is a manhole where the cable lands, and this is in Halifax, a cable that stretches from Halifax to Ireland, which is unusual. Almost all the cables stretch from Long Island or the Jersey Shore to farther south in England. And the basic principle again is this fundamental idea of light through a tube, and the landing stations, as they're called, the buildings on either end I think of them as lighthouses. They are pulsing light, and the light goes in at one end of the ocean and comes out on the other end, amplified by these sort of things that look like bluefin tuna, these amplifiers that sit on the ocean floor and are powered through the cable itself and amplify the signal every 50 miles or so until it's received on the other side. And then again, sort of remarkably and it's if sort of astonishingly, If that basic unit today is a 10 gigabit per second wavelength, then you'll have multiple wavelengths or colors of light through a single strand of fiber with 4, 6, or 8 strands of fiber in a single cable, the thickness of a garden hose. And so if you hold it, a garden, it's sort of easy to grasp in this dimension, and almost impossible to grasp in the other dimension, in the 4 or 5 or 6 or 8,000 mile range. And that, if we talk about the internet if we talk about a sort of global village, it's these cables that are the absolute sort of fundamental physical medium of those connections. So this is my friend Simon, who I've never actually met. I've only seen him a few times on the telepresence screen. And he until very recently just switched jobs, but he worked for Tata Communications, which is the communications wing of Tata, the big Indian industrial conglomerate, based in Singapore. So he's an Englishman based in Singapore, working for an Indian company. And like a lot of people in the undersea cable industry, he's not only English, but he's 42. Almost all undersea cable people are 42, because they started about the same time, 20 years ago. And he has this absolutely expansive geographic imagination. Tata Communications got its start by essentially picking up out of bankruptcy a cable across the Atlantic and a cable across the Pacific, a particularly big cable with a lot of, it came at the end of the boom, so benefited from that slightly later technology around 2002, I think, and had more strands of fiber than the other cables. I think 8 strands across the Pacific, which was more. Most of them had been built with 4 or 6 strands of fiber. And so they picked up the 2 cables for a song, and then they started building more cables until they had completed the loop around the world. So they will send your bits one direction, or they will send your bits in the other direction. And they will promise that if their cable gets cut in one point, they'll just go around the other way. And that, to me, as a person interested in places, is just an unfathomable sort of way of thinking about the geography of the Earth, matched only perhaps by sort of air travel at its extremes. I like the fact that, at least from New York, Singapore Airlines, you can either fly to Singapore East or you can go west. There's sort of 2 flights. You can take your pick. But Simon was one of the few people building cables, and I really wanted to see a cable being built, landing on the beach, a brand new cable. And I asked, he said, yes, we do have one being built, and I was nervous about where it might be, like Guam, where have been a lot of cables recently, but it's very far away, or Somalia, where they were talking about a cable, but it's not a place you want to stand on the beach waiting for a cable to come. And it turned out that they had a cable going from Lisbon down the west coast of Africa, a new cable called the WAX cable, the West Africa Cable System. So he's, with a few days' notice, depended on the weather, a little after 9 on a Monday morning, this guy walked out of the water carrying a lightweight nylon line. And that was the first link between sea and land that would then be leveraged into this 8,000-mile cable down the coast of Africa. And he was a Spanish underwater construction worker and kind of looked like a pirate with like a hoop earring. And then the cable ship came around, and the skiff brought the messenger line out, and then with that connection made, the bulldozer started pulling the actual fiber optic cable itself in, and floated on buoys so they could get it in the right spot. And you can see the English engineers looking on. And then once the cable was in place, the guy in the wetsuit went back into the water with a big knife and started cutting the buoys off. So the buoys would pop up. You couldn't really see him. You could just see the buoys pop up out of the water, and the cable would drop to the floor. And he did that the whole kilometer out to the ship. And then when he got there, they gave him a glass of juice and a cookie, and then he jumped back in, he swam back, and then he lit a cigarette, and then the cable was in place. And then they had to get it ready to be attached to the shore end, the other cable that had been brought down the mile or so from the cable landing station, from this basically a lighthouse. And that was this incredibly physical process of starting with a hacksaw, taking the sort of steel the steel barrier off, and then getting more and more delicate, so that first the steel with a hacksaw, and then the sort of plastic coating. And then finally, by the time they were at the fibers and getting ready to fuse the fibers together, Herathen fiber to Herathen fiber with this kind of, hole punch looking machine, he was working like a jeweler. But when you see these guys with a hacksaw going at this cable to Africa, the internet starts to seem a lot less like a blob and starts to seem a lot more like an absolutely physical thing. And then when the tide goes down, they put this extra layer on it to protect it more. Out in the middle of the ocean, it's a thinner, lighter cable that's just resting there. But closer to shore, they bury it or protect it with these steel cases. This guy's looking on. And then when the tide goes all the way out, they try to avoid having to use scuba gear to get it buried even more. But what's so striking is that if it benefits from the absolute latest, material science and forward error correction and all these complicated things that allow this incredible rate of transmission, the places that these cables connect haven't changed since the telegraph in 100 or 150 years. The culture hasn't changed. You can see the English engineer in the background in the hat with the local laborers, and it's still these connecting, often these major port cities, Lisbon or New York or Singapore or Mombasa. These places that have always been the trade routes. And then after a few days, it was a 3 or 4 day process. The local the guy who was the local Tata guy was who was sort of my host, who was not particularly happy to see me because there was a lot going on. It was a busy week for him, and his boss had invited me to watch, which wasn't very fun for him. But needless to say, there was a little cafe sort of overlooking this spot. Where we sort of kept up a steady, pace of, espresso then beer as this whole process went on. But then at the end of it, there's this manhole with the cable in it, and the bulldozer they put the manhole cover back on, and the bulldozer pushes the sand over it, and life goes back to normal in this kind of dusty village a little bit south of Lisbon. And we forget about it. And that seems to me a shame. I mean, that seems to me, as the more and more we sort of give up to the cloud, the more and more we sort of send things up wherever they go, then the more responsibility we give up. The less we know about where they are and who's responsible for them and all of that. And instead, it doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem right. It makes me a little nervous that the sand is just pushed over them and we forget about them. There's a great Neil Stevenson line where he says that wired people should know something about wires. It's quite straightforward. So I want to finish with the kind of a tale of 2 data centers. And it could have been a tale of 3 data centers. And these 2 are the first ground-up data centers of the number 1 and number 2 most visited websites, Facebook and Google. There's also a data center in Quincy, Washington that is your data center. Has anyone been there? Yeah? Okay. Which I feel as if I should explain why I didn't go there. There are lots of good reasons. But at Quincy, I understand, is a great spot right now with huge sort of data center ecosystem happening. What was so striking to me, this is in the woods behind Facebook's brand new data center in Prineville, Oregon, and it's a Prineville. Facebook has sort of broken the mold by being incredibly vocal about the process the whole way through. And saying, this is where it is, this is why we're here. Prineville has embraced Facebook, Facebook has embraced Prineville. And while if my initial image of it was of this enormous 300,000 square foot data center, the first of 3 buildings, the size of 3 Walmarts, Walmart being the measure of big in all cases, as this some sort of industrial blight, when I got there, it seemed like the opposite. It seemed like everybody in Prineville was very excited to have Facebook there, that this had essentially replaced the industry that had left otherwise, and literally used the power capacity that had been developed for that collapsed industry. So this data center, as I'm sure is the case in Quincy as well, it's a different proportion, but uses as more power than the county in which it sits. But what was striking to me, being interested in the physical infrastructure of the internet, was the degree to which this was taken seriously as a monument. I believe that architecture expresses ideals, that it says something about what's going on inside. That's what it always has. That's why banks and libraries have been sort of celebrated buildings. And among all the places that I saw, this was both one of the newest, but also a place that seemed to take very seriously the kind of human idea of what it embodied, as expressed as well in the architecture. It's a surprising building both for how beautiful it is, and I admit that the engineers who work in it, it's not, this is not what they say. This is what I'm saying, but this is what I sort of read in the what I read from this building. And yet, so there's it's this sort of extremely beautiful data center, and there's a hot rod of a data center. I know as well, the containerization things that Microsoft had done take a different approach to the same end of building the absolute most efficient place it could be, a building-sized machine. But the challenge for me was to recognize that this was the source of important things, of announcements of new babies and new jobs, and and many more banal things on Facebook. And each of those blue lights represented a terabyte hard drive, and there were aisles and aisles and aisles of them. But it was still a leap from knowing what was ostensibly there to sort of feeling what that meant. It still required a sort of big leap of abstraction, even though I was standing in that place, even though I was actually there. And that's it was a start, but it certainly didn't go all the way in terms of connecting this physical world and this virtual world. But it was exciting for me because it seemed to indicate, on Facebook's part, a somewhat new culture of being wide open. And of course, there's a joke to be made about Facebook and your privacy, but it still seemed like this was a new sense about the sort of monumentality of the physical pieces of the internet. So the other piece, and I visited these two places back to back, was Google's data center in the Dalles, which until recently had sort of been unacknowledged. I don't know, when I was there exactly a year ago, there was no sign on the door. There's only a sign that said Voldemort Industries, until the satellite image of the data center on Google Maps was not just old but obscured, was actually smudged out. I spent a lot of time looking at your satellite image of it instead. Recently, that's been replaced. There's now a new satellite image, which I admit I'm kind of disappointed. I sort of enjoyed the fact that it was obscured, because it was after visiting dozens and dozens of these buildings and many pieces of the internet, and unfailingly being yes, a negotiation and a permission and a sort of a process of getting in. You couldn't just walk in. But once I was inside, the engineers who worked there, without fail, always wanted to make sure that I understood what I was seeing and what was going on and how this fit into the broader picture, because they believed that other people should know what they do and how this works, and they were very proud of what they do. And at Google, it was the opposite. It sort of played out as farce. I was invited over and then given essentially a tour of the parking lot. And when I said, what's going on inside this building, the response was, I'm sure that's information we have internally, but that's not something we talk about. Of course, you know what's going on inside your building. And then we all went to lunch, and there was a PR person went around the room and said, please tell Andrew how much you like working at Google, and how many people applied for your job. And this would seem, yes, in some ways this is a very familiar corporate attitude and environment. But it was striking to me to the degree at which it was the outlier among the dozens of places that I visited, and dozens and over 100 engineers that I spoke with, and the degree to which it seemed as if I wanted to hold Google to a higher standard. And this goes for lots of companies, for that, we give so much to Google, to anyone, and it seems like that trust needs to be extended back in some form or another. And I say that both as a journalist, eager to sneak around in interesting places, but also as an internet user, eager to sort of know what it is that I have entrusted to the cloud. And the contrast sort of really came home to me on the way from the Dalles down to Portland, along the Columbia River, past the Bonneville Dam. And the Bonneville Dam is an absolute fortress. There's huge gates off the highway, and there's an Army Corps of Engineer guard who checks your car and looks in your trunk, and then says, "Come on in, come on in." And there's a museum, and a sort of interpretive display, and a fish ladder, and all of these things that begin to tell the story of the whatever it is, 75 or 80-year history of this dam, which undoubtedly is a sort of security-sensitive place for very obvious physical reasons. But there's still the implication that this is ours, that this is some sort of public infrastructure, that this belongs to all of us. It belongs to the Army Corps of Engineers, but it belongs to all of us as well. And we're obviously a long way from that with the internet. There aren't really brewery tours of the internet. I think there could be. I think there's some interest in that. But it was really striking to me that there is this evolution that has to happen, that needs to happen as we put more and more of our life online. That there's a need to sort of know where those things are going and what's going on inside, and the sense of this becoming somehow ours. So, thank you. Happy to answer questions or comments or.
You guys use the mics.
Sure. So you mentioned several times that you were surprised how concentrated that infrastructure is.
Yeah.
Do you know if there are like any particular security measures to prevent sabotage or, attacks against that infrastructure?
Any particular
like security measures to protect that infrastructure?
Is the security measure? Yeah. The thing that was surprising to me was because of the sort of strange combination of publicness and privateness, the internet being made of private companies, but yet also always having to interact with each other, created this sort of surprising space where people were quite eager to talk about it. So that's the sort of announcement from it, and for almost without fail, if there was one, because of the market imperative of people, everybody having something to sell, either their network services or their piece of real estate or things like that, people were very eager to tell their story, which is true across technology journalism, certainly. As for security measures specifically, I was struck by the fact that a lot of the focus is both on meeting the audit requirements imposed upon by the customers. There has to be X number of cameras, there has to be X kind of security, and that's imposed by often the financial firms and things like that say we won't use your data center unless these things are in place. And also the basic theft in some ways is the bigger issue, just with the sheer cost of this equipment. So it was, certainly Equinix and Ashburn, for example, is unmarked. It's unmarked, but if you enter it into a map online, it's a red flag lands in the middle of the building. Equinix Ashburn, boom. I had a bizarre conversation with the head of security at one of the backbone companies who said, "We'd love to have you come over and visit. We really want to tell this story, but please do not disclose where our landing station is." And I didn't say this, but if you enter in the name of this company and the town that the landing station is in, it pops right up on the map, as is it published in the public record as an FCC as part of the thing for that. So we operate under the assumption that this is that these are somehow hiding in plain sight, but that obfuscation seems to be potentially more damaging to the future of the internet than sabotage. Oh, you have the mic, great.
Yeah. So do you have any interesting stories as to how you broke into kind of the inner circle to tell these stories? Because I know, at least for me, it took me a long time to break into kind of the inner circle of NANOG, the people that you talked about, as well as Equinix and Search and Data and Telex and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you seem to work on this for 2 years, but you get into the meat of it right away. So I was wondering, how did you do it?
I spent, beginning of 2009, just about 3 years ago, I spent about a 3 or 4 month learning curve of talking primarily to network engineers, to a handful of the folks at NANOG primarily, trying to understand what it was that they did. And what was always striking to me was their generosity of time, their eagerness to explain what it was they do and how it fit together, and also their surprise that no one had knocked on their door in a while. I mean, NANOG hadn't had a visiting journalist. It's an open conference. NANOG hadn't had a visiting journalist in several years, and it's almost as if we, as journalists, I mean, when I pitched my editor at Wired and said, "Oh, we should do something about wires," and he was, "Oh my God, I can't believe we forgot about the wires," and it hadn't come up. For those people who lived through the sort of broadband boom and bust, particularly for journalists, it was a sort of painful episode. But then between about 2002 and 2009, our relationship to the internet changed so dramatically. I mean, we stopped logging on, and it became this pervasive thing at all times. But in terms of the it was very much. I mean, it's very much a matter of Well, asking and hoping they understood that I was listening closely, and for the companies themselves, it's a very competitive business at the moment, and they're very eager to tell their story. Tata was very straightforward. They said, we want to compete with the AT&Ts and Verizon in North America, and we're happy to tell our story. When I went to look to inquire at AT&T about photographing for this original wired photo essay, their landing station in California in Point Arena, it took me 3 weeks to find the correct PR person to ask the question. The question had never been asked, and then I gave up. It was just, I spent 3 weeks, bouncing around the country from place to place, with nobody knew who might possibly be the one to give permission to even start a conversation about what this building was. That's only, there's obvious sort of scale issues, and that's a basic challenge. But that doesn't, for me, at all change the idea that these landing stations are interesting and their story should be told. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. I missed the first 5 minutes of your presentation, so sorry if you talked about this.
It was about South Park, mostly.
Oh, okay. Well, I got the South Park bit,
Okay,
so that's okay. I actually used to teach internet fundamentals like 15 years ago, and it was all about not like the origins of the internet. I mean, do you talk about, or did you investigate, sort of the original ARPANET stuff and the original sites? And I always remember kind of, hearing some weird statistic about it being designed so that if 75% of it was destroyed, it could still function and that kind of thing. I mean, do you get into that, or what did you learn from your explorations there?
I do, and because my lens is always insistently physical, I talk about some of the for lack of a better word, sort of logical history of the development of packet switching and things like that. But then I go to visit the first piece of the internet, the first IMP, the interface message processor, at UCLA, where Leonard Kleinrock, one of the sort of fathers of the internet, where he's still a professor, he's still in the same office. He was there on Labor Day weekend 1969 when the IMP was delivered from BBN in Cambridge, by air freight. This was the very first node of the ARPANET. And amazingly, the IMP was in this sort of little conference room across from his office with like stacks of coffee cups on it, and sort of completely forgotten about it. And he'd struggled really hard to make sure it wasn't forgotten. And I haven't seen it yet, but I guess it was it last spring already or 6 months ago, that the room that it sat in when the very first link between UCLA and Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park was activated, the room that the IMP was in has now been turned into the Kleinrock Internet History Museum and Reading Room or something like that. So it is celebrated. But it's astonishing to me that this is sort of unequivocally the very first node of the internet, of the ARPANET that then became the first piece of the internet. And it's sat there literally in a closet with styrofoam coffee cups on top of it. And it's indicative as well of the way that we don't really treat the physical history of the network with very much care. So, yeah.
So I'm going to ask a couple questions from online. One is, someone's curious about the brewery tour you suggested for the internet, especially for a kid who, has an iPad and is very involved with that. So that's question number one. The second question was, they were curious about Quincy and why you didn't go.
Why I didn't go to Quincy? That's a good question. I have to think about that. Well, the brewery tour, I don't know. I kind of like that idea. I mean, it seems to me that is, that if it seems to me there is a lot of curiosity about it. It seems to me that the security measures that have in the past sort of kept things really locked down don't, because of the, I don't see them as having quite as much traction as they once did. The trend in the data center, there's always the joke, data centers are like Fight Club, don't talk about data centers. But that's now opening up. A lot of people are sharing a lot more. The most beautiful images out there of data centers are a set of pictures that were taken from the New York Times Magazine of Quincy. And that was started this process of opening up. So I love the idea that there would be, a sort of brewery-style tour of, it wouldn't take much. One of the most likely places is, the buildings in New York, or even 111 8th Avenue, which is one of these sort of 3 dominant buildings in New York where networks meet, along with 60 Hudson and 32 Avenue of the Americas, Google now bought, and is still a very key network hub. And it seems like such a wonderful idea to have, to sort of open up, put a piece of glass in front of one of these rooms and say, this is where your email goes, and sell T-shirts. I don't know. Seems kind of straightforward. The Quincy question. I'm trying to remember. For me, I mean, the process is one of seeking out the good stories, seeking out the people who are most enthusiastic about telling those stories, seeking out the stories that haven't been told in the same way before. And I think a lot of the issue with Quincy was partly geography. I knew Facebook had opened this brand new data center, and the timing was just right. I happened to be there the day it was switched on. So I knew I wanted to do that. I wasn't sure if I could make it up to Quincy, another couple hundred miles. I was also getting a lot of help from Mike Manos. Does anyone know Mike? Yeah, who had been the person who built out Quincy. Who was the kind of, I think, leader of the team. I'm sure there are other people who are on that team out there who helped him with that, but he was the one who had been most vocal about telling that story of Quincy. And by the time I got to him, he had moved on. He'd left Microsoft, and it wasn't clear, there wasn't as vocal a person who was sort of telling the story of these buildings at Microsoft at the time. I think there was a bit of a void with that. And then the last piece of it as well was there had been this very large, excellent New York Times Magazine story that had focused on Mike and I believe had focused on Quincy as well, written by a friend and colleague of mine. So it was in some ways just the luck of the draw that I was looking for unexplored territory. So,
yeah, so all these networks obviously cross political boundaries. Did you run into any issues where you saw there were political implications of networks being put in different areas or data being transitioning borders?
I heard that most from Mike Manos, actually, who talked about the need to acknowledge the need to acknowledge data sitting specifically in one place versus another. In my own travels, I was struck by the differences in the way that both physically things looked in different places, and also by the sort of cultural attitude with which networks were connecting to each other. I mean, the most dramatic was the difference that in these internet exchange points, if in the US they're based on real estate, if they're based on somebody owning the building and providing the service and the mechanism for one router to connect to another, in Europe it's mostly these exchanges, these nonprofit or for-profit exchanges, like the DKIX, the Deutschland Commercial Internet Exchange, or AMSIX, the Amsterdam Internet Exchange, that are sort of collectives and that provide the sort of both the social fabric and in some cases the actual switching fabric for networks to connect to each other. But I didn't look. I did not look. I admit that I was more focused on the color of the walls than on the laws. So, yeah.
Based on your experience, how many backhoes will it take to shut down the entire internet?
I get asked this question all the time. I don't know. No, it's not something. I mean, it's obviously not something I entertain seriously. It's not something I recommend entertaining seriously, and it's not something that I heard a lot of concern about from the people I was talking to. I think one of the the two worst and most significant network outages in recent years. One was an earthquake in Luzon off the Straits of Taiwan that cut, I think, 6 of the 8 undersea cables connecting Southeast Asia, and that really had a major impact. And if an undersea cable is cut, you have to send a ship out and throw a grappling hook over the side and pull the cable up and fuse it back together. And there were multiple breaks in multiple places. They had to do that for weeks and months. So that was one. And then one of the second major outage was in Silicon Valley, I think 3 or 4 years ago, where somebody had in fact gone into a manhole and cut exactly the right cables to bring out, to really do major damage and create a big mess for a big portion of the area, which was discovered to be a union dispute, somebody knew exactly which cables to cut. Yeah. Then there's the story of the 75-year-old woman who was scavenging for copper in Armenia and cut through Georgia, the country of Georgia's fiber optic connection in Georgia was down for 3 hours. So in Georgia, the answer is 1. Not even a backhoe. That was a grandmother. So we have time for a couple more questions. Or?
We do have time.
You talk about reuse of the Western Union building. You showed the railroads. Could you talk about sort of reuse of you also talk about coming out of 2002 and the whole crash and Global Crossing and the other companies that went down. Just from an architectural criticism point of view, how much of that reuse, has happened? Do you see any changes in the external appearances, or is it just gut the building, reuse the shell? One example here, a lot of us have been up through the tunnel that goes under Snoqualmie Pass, which was built as a railroad tunnel, and it was basically revitalized because it made it economical to run fiber cable through there.
I haven't heard that story. It's a great story. No, I mean the Western Union story, the 60 Hudson Streets. I mean that's a building that that in some ways is the worst possible building to do this. I mean, large floor plates and heavy floors, and it has some sort of physical advantages to it. But it ended up being so important, partly after the breakup of the Bell system, its proximity to the AT&T Long Lines building at the time, 32nd Avenue of the Americas, and it turned out that Western Union had kept control of their quote-unquote network, which was actually the conduits under West Broadway from 60 Hudson Street to 32nd Avenue of the Americas, and that was it was MCI basically that colonized 60 Hudson, and then tied into 32nd Avenue of the Americas. And the story that I recount in the book is that when the breakup came, when the judge said, "Okay, you got to let him in," and AT&T said, "We don't have, you can't come in the building," and MCI basically said, "We're in the basement. We're there. We got there. So now you have to interconnect," and that's what colonized 60 Hudson. But it's always striking to me, even if these buildings aren't ideal, there's always some fact of geography. They're always in some crucial spot, like the 60 Hudson's case, the sort of elbow between Lower Manhattan, always an important place for telecommunications, and the first way out of town, the Holland Tunnel. And then there's always some charismatic salesperson who convinced the first two networks to come and then to that otherwise. And for Equinix and Ashburn, that was certainly the case, to the point where the inside of the building is designed particularly as if it were the lobby of a fancy hotel to appeal to the network engineers who would be putting their stuff in there, which means making it look like a science fiction movie. So, thank you all. Thanks.